Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Thursday, August 16, 2018 meeting of the Housing and Redevelopment Authority. Roll call, please. Ms. Ellison?
Commissioner Fisher?
Here.
Commissioner Staunton? Chair Hovland?
Here.
Commissioner Brendel? Here. Commissioner Stewart?
Here.
We have a meeting agenda in front of us this morning. Is there anyone that wishes to amend or modify the agenda?
Let me pull it up here. Yes, I do, because one of the items on the consent agenda needs no vote. So I'd like to move that off. Consent, it is 5D, the North Ramp expansion.
Oh, just a discussion item.
Yeah, it's just an information item, so it doesn't need a vote.
Okay. I noticed that too. Okay. Anybody have an issue with that? Remove 5D. Okay. Anyone else have any changes or modifications? Manager Neal, anything else?
No, sir.
To add? Okay. With the amendment being made to the agenda with the deletion of 5D, is there a motion to adopt the amended agenda?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion second to adopt the amended agenda. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. We're going to go into the community comment portion of the agenda, but I want to preface it with a couple of comments I think might be helpful. So our council, either sitting now as the HRA or the council, is meeting 4 times a month. And so these HRA meetings, like all of you, we've got work pressures, day job pressures. Usually the council meets at night. So we are going to get out of here promptly at 9 o'clock. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the public comment portion of the agenda here in a second. But the purpose of this meeting being called or put on the HRA agenda was to give folks in our community a chance to hear what council members, also sitting as HRA members, are thinking about this whole lid concept. Because we've never had a chance to talk about that in a public setting, although we've had a lot of public engagement, and I think Bill Neuendorf will talk about the public engagement we've had over the past couple of years on this idea. Nobody's ever had a chance to hear what the council has to say. If we use the time up with community comment, we're not going to get to where I think we all need to get, and that is for folks to hear what the council is thinking at this point in time, and the HRA members about this particular idea. So another thing I want to tell you as a way of background. I remember the city manager in Bloomington telling me one time, nothing's easy in a fully developed community. Here we are now a fully built out town. Harkening back to some of our old mayors, there was a time when 3 of them were living, Jim Van Valkenburg, Fred Richards, and Denny Metzold, of course, still living. But Jim Van Valkenburg told me one time that when they did the Dewey Hill development out near the Braemar Golf Course, people came to City Hall with coffins and with black robes on, saying we were ruining Edina as we knew it. Of course, we all know that's just part of the fabric of our town now. One of our other neighbors that's actually in favor of the lid wrote and said, this is kind of like Centennial Lakes. I don't know if it's like Centennial Lakes because that was a gravel pit, and there was actually land involved. Like we have land involved across the street at the old public works site where we're trying to figure out what to do with that property. And we've been looking at that issue for over 10 years. Sometimes we get concerned about the time that's been involved in looking at land and what to do with it. But, a group of citizens decided on that particular project that we should do a combination of public and private uses. The good news is over there that while this has taken quite a bit of time, the value of that land, and we're getting it appraised right now, the value of that land, I think, has gone from an appraised value when we built the new public works site of about $4 million to a little over $8 million. So the holding of the land as we tried to figure out what to do with it was a good thing as we patiently waited to figure out what to do. This is a more ethereal sort of thing. This isn't involving land that we have available for development or redevelopment. It involves something that came about as a result of the work that people did on the framework for the public works site. And so one of the early ideas was that we'd have some sort of connective tissue between East and West Edina that would allow people to move back and forth in a non-motorized way. The idea resurfaced 2 or 3 years ago. Bill's going to talk about that. And then we started looking at this idea because they've done it other places in the country to see if this would be something that would improve the quality of life for the residents of our community. And so that's what that's the sort of the origin of the notion. And we've got a long way to go. We know that up here, but we know that you don't know what we know. And so we're interested in knowing what or hearing what you have for concerns. But if we talk about that in concerns of residents, we're just not going to get to where we need to be by 9 o'clock. With respect to that concerns of residents, so that portion of the agenda, I'll tell you that our rule has been that you can't speak to anything that's on the agenda, the particular meeting that's being held. That's to protect you, not us. That's to protect residents of the city of Edina that have come to a meeting that they thought was a public meeting but not a public hearing. If we're going to have a public hearing, we notice that up and give people an opportunity to be notified of it and an opportunity to be heard. I think all of you in this room would think that it would be appropriate at some point in time to have a public hearing or maybe multiple public hearings on this idea as soon as we have something that is worthwhile talking about. So I think it would be inappropriate today for us to talk about in concerns of residents any issue that is dealing with the lid or even related to the lid. So I don't think it would be appropriate and fair to your fellow residents where we don't have anything noticed up as a public hearing where you're going to get up and talk about your concerns about, let's say, increased pressure on the school district, more traffic in the area, which is something that we, of course, know about, and we've already done a traffic study and a traffic plan for the entire Grandview area. So if you have a concern that you want to talk to us about that's not directly related to the lid or in some tangential way related to the lid, come on up. But otherwise, I'm not going to allow any public testimony about the lid or any related matter to the lid this morning. We're going to have plenty of time to talk about that. And I think, as I said, the important thing is that people know what the council members are thinking about relative to this project. So that's, having said that, is there anyone that wants to come forward and address a matter for us? Thank you.
Bruce Christensen, 4515 Browndale Avenue, 50-year resident of Edina. And I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak. Specifically, it's a relatively small group of dedicated people at the HRA and planning staff. I want to talk about the responsibility for the next 10, 20, 30 years, just as a general statement, and some of the consequences to the 2018 comprehensive plan as it relates to general development in the Edina area. So you've been asked or tasked with making commitments right now that will influence our population growth vis-a-vis housing unit construction for the next 10, 20, 50 years or longer. We will bike, drive, walk by these buildings for the next 75 years. Overbuilding has extraordinary consequences. I've got a chart here, if you get it up, good. The information I'm presenting is from Edina Public School documents. This shows K-5 schools are expected to exceed functional capacity by 75 students for the 2022-23 school year. According to a conversation I've had recently with district staff, these figures do not include construction commitments you've made the past few years. I'd appreciate if you'd verify this assumption, because if correct, using school enrollment formula suggests these pending units will add another 182 K through 5 students. This demonstrates just how sensitive our schools are to expanding our 14,300 in-district housing units as shown. Edina's crown jewel is quality public education. Building new facilities to accommodate another elementary school, while challenging, would be a better outcome than overloading existing K-5 classrooms. Edina is going through a population growth at a rate not seen since the 1960s, as it indicates. Failure to plan for the children this growth will generate has dire consequences to our sought-after residential real estate. Any discussion of neighborhood redevelopment, the purview of this group, needs context of its impact on education and the city's enrollment capability. This should be a foundational element of the 2018 comp plan. To that end, how is the school district used in preparation for the comp plan? Threats to quality of best in-state education will elicit a powerful community response as you juggle requests from private developers for larger and larger building proposals. To build credibility for the comp plan, please consider a robust public opportunity. Let the public read and comment and influence final drafting so that it can truly reflect the residents' needs. Absent public buy-in, this document will be a lightning rod to local neighborhood projects that will come before this planning body. I don't know if I've got one more minute.
You should stick with the 3-minute rule.
Am I timed out?
Yeah, you're timed out.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very
Christensen.
much. Appreciate it.
Morning.
Good morning. I'm Amy Alvaro. I reside at 5027 Wooddale Lane. We've lived in Edina since 1991. My business is in road construction. I do a subcontractor, just a small piece of a lot of road construction projects, but work frequently with engineers at Mndot and street planning and various other aspects. My question is, I have not seen cities, and I worked on virtually every residential project in the city for cities, all the suburbs, for the last 6 years. I have not seen cities undertake a project of this size and scope that involves replacing, rebuilding, the city committing to, as opposed to Mndot committing to, replacing bridges. I'd like to think about how the city is factoring in the various entrance and exit ramps off of Highway 100. For example, as we've seen in the reconstruction on 169 or further up Highway 100, when the highway changes significantly, the entrance and exit points must be consolidated. Mndot will not allow the same number that used to be. So I'd like to make sure that as we're considering various projects in and around the city, we're working with increasing the capacity and the ability for us to handle the roads. And I'd like to understand where the city's authority comes for spending this amount of potential taxpayer money without a vote or a referendum.
Thank you.
My name is Cal Simmons. I live at 5038 Bruce Place. I've been a resident of Edina for more years than I care to disclose. Whether this relates to the lid or not, I believe we need a comprehensive traffic plan. I don't know if you tried to get home yesterday, traffic backed up back here. How many times have I seen the traffic almost back up to Interlochen Country Club to the Holiday Station? My path home comes up Vernon Avenue. Frequently, the traffic backs up beyond the curve around the corner there. If you've ever been on France Avenue coming north, the traffic backs up behind 54th Street. We simply have to come up with some plan and, to figure out how we can ease this traffic crush for several hours a day. And this doesn't even take into account the new development at 50th, the new buildings right over here that were just recently approved. So all we're doing is adding to this traffic crush. I urge you to order, to set up some kind of a traffic management analysis on how we're going to get control of this, because if by just pounding more and more and more traffic in here, it's going to detract from the attractiveness of our community. So I urge you to take a look at some type of overall traffic management proposal that will ease this situation. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mr. Simmons. Anyone else on community comment? Morning.
I'm Ron Anderson, 5728 Kemmeridge Drive. Been an Edina resident for over 30 years. And so I want to bring to your attention something I think you're already familiar with. There is, as you can see here this morning, and is evidence from conversations all across the city, there is a widespread sense of frustration about the pace and breadth of development and what comes out of that. Last night, I spent some time going through your Big Ideas workshop in April of last year. It's very interesting. There's a lot of work that was done there, and it was intended, as you know, to be a bridge to the 2018 comp plan. In that, there were 6 existing small areas noted for potential development. 44th and France, which is underway today. 50th and France, underway, and it was just spoken to. Grandview, the lid. The flats are at Wooddale and Valley View. 70th and Cahill, not quite yet. Southdale, absolutely underway. Pentagon Park, believe that there are 585 new housing units proposed at Pentagon Park. I believe that's been approved. Tonight, there is a neighborhood outreach meeting at 7200 and 7250 France. They are going to be proposing to the Planning Commission, to the Council, another 322 units there. That, by the way, would be 6 stories as opposed to the 4 that are outlined in the comp plan. So I just want to speak to you about taking a deep breath, stepping back a little bit, and evaluating. The impact on the community is notable. And there's so many that feel that there is a change in character and nature that I think it's important for you to consider that as we go forward. The Big Ideas workshop, let me give you your words, or the words that came out of that. The final discussion and decision to include or not include a big idea in a comprehensive plan should consider a number of additional evaluation criteria, including affordability, costs and benefits, opportunity costs, environmental consequences and impacts, implementation feasibility, and I think most important, at least for these comments this morning, is public acceptance. And so it appears that the area small study process is not informing enough people. And so I just say unintended consequences should be a key element in making decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
Steve Gartner, 5008 Arden Avenue, Edina resident for 30-plus years. I'm looking forward to hearing what your views are on the projects, the development projects that are being considered, because I'd like to know from you all what you see as the value of these projects from a resident point of view. I understand the tax-based piece, the comparison between, developing blank land where the sand pits used to be, 76th in France, is a whole different kettle of fish than redeveloping what's being proposed as the lid, for example. So there's, in my mind, no comparison between the two. So I'm looking forward to hearing these comments. I echo the things that have been said before about resident input and resident awareness. I think that reading the materials, to my eye, what I read in the materials that have been presented by the Edina City government, seems like this is a foregone conclusion. It's already a done deal. So I'm hoping that's not the case. Look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you, Mr. Gartner. Okay.
My name is George Buchak. I live at 4121 West 44th Street. I just want to speak briefly to affordable housing. In my opinion, our best shot at materially influencing this very important obligation to our most vulnerable neighbors excuse me, is a well-coordinated plan to preserve existing and potentially vulnerable family housing units. Right now, we have a lot of older apartment communities Those owners could be approached proactively and also could be coordinated by the city and selected. We could select some nonprofit partners like Common Bond, PPL, Beacon Interfaith to acquire and commit these units to permanently affordable housing stock. If we can drive this conversation early in the process, maybe we can preempt the typical auction process and acquire these communities. As we've seen recently, once they get sold to private ownership, rents rise and vulnerable people get displaced. In my opinion, in the next 20, 30 years from now, this aggressive, well-coordinated preservation strategy will make Edina a leader in affordable housing. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Mr. Buchak.
Hi, my name is Lisa Sporsich, and I'm a resident in the Sunny Slope neighborhood. I've been in Edina for about 15 years now, 4905 Ridge Place. The primary thing I would like to understand is what is the due process for getting community input on the Grandview Greene project, and what does the approval process look like in order to determine a go forward or not go forward on this project? Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Anyone else? All right, good. Thank you. Thanks for that input. All right, we've got a consent agenda. We've got a removal of 5D. Is there anyone else on the council wishes to remove an item from the consent agenda? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to adopt the consent agenda as shown.
So moved.
So moved. Second.
Got a motion and second to adopt the consent agenda with the exclusion of 5D. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. On to the reports and recommendations portion of the agenda, which is the main body of conversation this morning, and that is the Grandview Greene notion, planning strategy, next steps. Mr. Neuendorf has this matter, and then it will be council discussion. No action required today, just a discussion.
Yes, thank you and good morning. Our primary topic of conversation this morning is an update and a discussion of the planning strategy and some of the next steps to consider on the Grandview Greene proposal. This is a project, this is touchy. I have just a couple renderings here and just to provide a brief background. This is a concept that first came up back in 2009, 2010 as part of the second effort of the Grandview District community planning effort. It was an initial concept that at that point was dismissed as something that Mndot probably would not be interested in. In 2014, we learned that Mndot was interested in these types of ideas, and we worked with some folks at the University of Minnesota who brought their idea forward to let us know that Mndot was actually open to these ideas. They were working on with a different community in Minneapolis on a similar project, and the consultants were familiar with the Grandview District and reminded us that, hey, this is something that you might want to think about in this area, again, as a long-term plan. So in 2016 and 2017, the city and the HRA invested some money to work with consultants to explore this concept and see if it does have viability. And to learn for ourselves what the stance of Mndot would be. So the rendering that we have up here this morning shows a overall concept from an aerial perspective, and then in the image in the upper left-hand corner illustrates what a freeway lid is. That was one of the two most frequent questions that we received when we did our initial public engagement last fall. What is a lid? And the second biggest, our most frequent question was, well, what does Mndot think about this? Because they'll never let you do that around here. So the basic concept is that in order to grow in this area of the community, since the natural topography used to be a hill, but it was partially removed back in the early 70s, we could restore that former topography, create a public park on top of the freeway in the airspace above the freeway, and then the area on the side of the freeway, which is currently an on-ramp and off-ramp and some leftover area with steep slopes, that space could be leased or sold to private development. As we went through our initial concepts, we learned that the new taxes from that private development should be more than ample to pay for the infrastructure to enable them. And that's what initially kept us going. Last fall, or actually this past
Bill,
spring.
let me interrupt you for a
Yes,
moment.
sir.
One of our residents asked a question about, gee, I haven't seen other cities do this, a project of this scope. And you might comment a little bit about other projects we've seen in Minnesota as well as across the country where this is being done.
Sure. The first project of this scale in Minnesota was done up in Duluth when they expanded a freeway back in the, I think, late 70s or mid 80s. I don't know the exact time. But there's actually several of these in Minnesota, and once you start looking, it was kind of amazing to several folks how many of these there actually are. So the one in Duluth is pretty significant to connect the neighborhood to the lakefront. When the Hiawatha Light Rail was built in Minneapolis near Minnehaha Creek, they constructed something similarly running through Longfellow Gardens. Fort Snelling, if you've been to the fort on a school trip or any day, there's a large gravelly type area that connects the fort with some of the green space where the school buses drop kids off. That's actually a lid. State Highway 5 runs underneath it. And then most recently, the city of Bloomington did something similar, much different in scale and purpose at Mall of America in front of that new JW Marriott. So those are just the examples we found in Minnesota. We also found examples in Wisconsin.
The Lowry Hill Tunnel would also be an example.
Lowry Hill Tunnel is similar, except that is truly a tunnel as opposed to a lid. A lid generally covers a hole in the ground. A tunnel bores a hole into the ground. But essentially, at the end of the day, the Lowry Tunnel could be similar. Madison has one at their convention center near downtown. The city of Chicago has some much different in scale. Millennium Park, for example, is an example of a lid. It spans parking and train tracks as opposed to freeways. But Phoenix, the state of Washington has several. Los Angeles is building one. Boston's Big Dig is probably the biggest lid in the country, possibly the world. So there's a lot of these out there. And as we learned a little bit more, we found out that this was not as far-fetched as some first thought it could be. We also engaged with an architect to put some renderings to this because we had a hard time explaining to the community what is this and what does it look like and how would it work and why are we doing it. So these are a couple example illustrations just to convey what this is. But again, at the heart of this whole concept is a new public green space that is centrally located. It's both attractive and functional.
So I think just for re-emphasis, Amy from Wooddale Lane said that she wanted to know about the authority to spend taxpayer money. Where does that exist? And the assumption being that taxpayer money would be used to build this lid. I think that's the same concern all of us had early on was, as we thought about this idea, when we heard Mndot had some level of interest, that was at the forefront of everybody's mind that we didn't want any taxpayer in Edina to be paying for a potential lid if it otherwise made any sense. So you might just talk about that a moment too as we've gone through that analysis.
Sure. So in 2016 we worked with the consulting firm called Architectural Field Office, and they led the initial effort to do an initial concept study on this. They engaged Jones Lang LaSalle to do an initial economic analysis. Again, this is very high level, but to cut to the end of that story, the financial analysis by JLL indicated that the new development alone, not considering any other neighborhood remodels or what happens 4 blocks away or anything like that. Just the new construction taxes would pay for the infrastructure for the lid times 3. And so that, surprised us that it was to that degree. That's a very rough number, and we need to get more precise. But, just from an estimating purpose, when we learn that there's about 8 acres of land that is currently either owned by Mndot or the city. I think the county has one little sliver of that. And it's all used as on-ramps, off-ramps, the slopey areas on the side of the highway. If you put the park on top of the highway, suddenly those 8 acres of land aren't just extra land on the side of the highway. It's buildable land. So when you put 8 acres on the tax rolls and then build new buildings on it, that new tax base adds up very quickly. So one of our challenges when we studied this concept further in this past year was to find out how much construction we actually needed to pay for this type of concept. The city, if this were a private investor, if they saw a 300% return on their money, that would get their attention. But as a community, that's not our primary goal. We want to create a great space that serves this community for the next several generations. So one of our challenges was to do some testing of how much construction do we need? Is it high rise? Is it low rise? Is it mid rise? Because ultimately we want to make sure that there's enough new monies generated to pay for the infrastructure so that we don't overburden the local taxpayers. Mndot is willing to participate at some degree, but also they're not throwing around tens of millions of dollars just for any project either. So I mean, the whole project has to make sense for everybody. But it was those financial forecasts that really made us think that this could be possible at a reasonable scale. So,
Now, one of the things that we haven't done is looked at. I've talked to some of the folks in our community about this. That 3-to-1 return on investment was really based on maximum density or maximum build out, and of course that makes people apprehensive. About what are the potential impacts of that, either known or unknown. So we haven't done, to my knowledge, any financial analysis of how much green space how much development would be required to let us maximize the green space. In other words, the minimal amount of development that would accompany green space, which was the original notion anyway, I think.
Right.
That we wanted primarily green space, but if we could pull off that connective idea of creating a central park for Edina, for example, where people could gather, that how much development would we need to have support that so the taxpayers wouldn't be supporting it?
Correct, yeah.
We don't know the answer to that yet.
We don't know that yet. At this point, we know that we don't need the intense development to get the 3-to-1 return. So the more recent round, which we finished this spring, shows buildings that vary in height and density from 2-story buildings on the east side and the northeast side of the district to 8 to 10-story buildings on the western edge, closer to Our Lady of Grace and the 5100 Eden building on that area where it's further away from single-family residents. So right now we know that this density level should pay for the overall infrastructure, but we've not gone to that level of specificity. At this point, we're just working with rough engineering estimates. I mean, this project is, I use the word concept, I use the word preliminary quite frequently. Right now we have what in my opinion is a very compelling vision. We could not build this at this point, and I would also want to clarify that before we sought any approvals for land entitlements, land transactions, public debt, we need much more detailed engineering drawings so that we can be more certain of the actual costs of those roadway improvements and of the lid. Right now, an estimate is a great starting point, looks good from the estimate, but if we were to advance into a full preliminary engineering type of analysis that would be required to work with Mndot, we'd really need to have much greater detail. And we are not at that point today. That's not what our request is. As we've...
Are you going to discuss the activity engaging the public to date in your presentation?
Sure. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
So in our past presentations, we've had pages of groups and dates and all that. I didn't bring that with me this morning, but in 2017, from about August through January of 18, we wanted to put more meat onto this conversation, and that's the time that we engaged a lot of the commissions, we engaged the schools, we engaged the neighbors, sought out focus groups of our old Grandview alumni. We had over close to 60 people that have, over the last 10 years, been repeatedly and persistently and eagerly up for the conversation of what can happen in this Grandview area. So we engaged them in the winter months of last year as well. And all of those conversations, as well as this conference, as well as this concept, are really focused on those 7 guiding principles that the community group came up with back in 2010 when we first started talking about what the Grandview district is and what it could be. So those principles I have up on the screen this morning, and again, I'm not going to read through all of them, but a couple of them are really interesting, I think. And that's a challenge to leverage publicly owned parcels to create a vibrant and connected district. All of the land that we're talking about in these concept drawings are publicly owned. There's another 8 acres of privately owned property next to the highway that might also change at some point in time. But we have not included any of that in these renderings. So that's why some of the drawings, some of the site plans are kind of skinny and linear, because that's the highway right-of-way. If this were actually to be built in the future, I would imagine that at least some of those parcels might grow and change. We'd probably end up with more regular street block sizes rather than narrow ones. But truly, with all this publicly owned land, I think there is a way to better create a community in the future. And then another of the challenges of the 7 guiding principles was to turn perceived barriers, like a 8-lane state highway, into an opportunity, and consider layering development on top of that supporting infrastructure to take advantage of the natural topographies in the Grandview area. That was written back in 2010 before we even got to this point. But as we further studied this concept, we wanted to make sure that we kept those 7 guiding principles in mind. So as far as the public engagement, as far as details, we have had several meetings. We had a couple open houses, but that is far from a full-blown public engagement process. As I mentioned earlier, this is an initial concept in the earliest stages. Some of the questions that we were asked at the open houses last fall, I heard some of those same questions this week. We don't have specific answers about all the details of the project. We're still in that high-level mode, and a decision has not yet been made to even go further. So before we can get a very detailed answer, as a community, we need to decide, are we moving forward? What's the time frame? What's the partnership? And that's where your direction and your discussion is sought. Another one of the compelling aspects of this project is when we compared some of these other examples that I mentioned in the state, each of those were done for one or possibly 2 specific purposes. Longfellow Gardens with a Hiawatha light rail was intended strictly to continue a public park that was already there. So green space was the outcome. In downtown Minneapolis, all the parking ramps, the ABC ramps by the Twin Stadium, that's actually built on a freeway lid, and the primary purpose of that was to get more parking for downtown Minneapolis. Not about connections, not about green space. Fort Snelling was also done to enhance that green space. In Bloomington at Mall of America, that smaller lid over Lindau Lane was strictly done as an economic development effort to allow the mall to expand. With the Grandview Green concept, we're not just hitting one of these goals, we're hitting 4 out of 4. That's never been done in Minnesota. And again, that was one of the challenges that we heard early on from the initial discussion, was that this concept isn't just an exercise to spend a lot of tax dollars on a big bridge. It's done purposely and intentionally to improve the neighborhood, to provide an amenity for the community that we don't have today, to be practical and utilitarian. We still need to get on and off the freeway, we still have to park cars, but it's also done to grow economic development so that there's a funding source. And that's what's been missing from these other projects that have been done in Minnesota. They have been an investment in the community with no direct financial return. For this Edina Grandview Greene concept, we want to completely turn that around. And if we're going to make an investment of millions of dollars, whether it's the state or the city or whoever makes it, we want there to be a direct financial revenue to pay for that expense. And that's been one of our fundamentals of this whole conversation. So this morning, we're asking for your discussion and your direction on 3 suggestions that staff has about future actions. As evidenced by many of our questions in the last couple days and weeks, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of concern about the project. And when we last presented to this group, it was in April of this year, where we presented our findings of our most recent studies. The HRA authorized staff to hire some consultants to do some studies on the infrastructure elements of this and a little bit of design. And one of the key purposes of that was to see if there was what we call any fatal flaws in this whole concept. Early on, there were questions of, will Mndot allow this to happen in the city? Will they allow it to happen in the suburbs? Is it a tourist attraction? Is it a lot of big reasons why they should say no? And as we've studied this, we looked into the stormwater, we looked into local traffic, we looked into highway traffic, we looked into cost, and all those big picture items did not yield anything that said, stop, this doesn't make any sense at all. We haven't reached the point where we're saying go, but there's been no fatal flaw as discovered by any of the studies that we've performed. And while we presented that back in April, one thing the HRA has not done is take a proactive statement to let people know what we're doing, what our intentions are, what our time frame is, what some of the next steps would be. So that's one of staff's recommendations, is to consider a future resolution that puts some of the thoughts and purposes and discussion items on paper, just to clarify the conversation for the community. Frankly, that would also be helpful with Mndot. When we first met with Mndot about a year ago, we asked for meetings. We were expecting maybe a meeting once a quarter. They said, great, this is something we really want to pursue. Let's meet every 2 weeks and see if we can make some sense of this. And so, with exception, we've been meeting typically twice a month to explore this. Mndot has actually created a new office for this type of project, not just Edina, we're special, but we're not that special. But they created a new office called the Department of Community Connections. So Mndot is currently working with at least 3 and possibly 4 communities on these types of projects. And I think my colleagues at Mndot would be okay with me saying that they haven't done this before, and there's not a clear path, and it's very complex. So some of our conversations have just been, throwing ideas around. Well, what are your regulations? What is your process? What is your policy? How do we if we decide to go, how do we even do it from an agency working together? Currently, we know that Mndot is strongly interested in these types of projects, and we think that the Edina one certainly has potential. So one of the other things that we've been working on is starting to draft initial lease terms with Mndot, and that's something that we'd encourage your support of. We do not intend to enter into a lease. I think we're far too early with that, but it'd be nice to know and nice to have on paper, more like a letter of intent. What are some of the key requirements of the city? What are some of the key requirements of Mndot? How do we work together? We've recently signed a memorandum of understanding with Mndot. That was the outcome of our April meeting, where we agreed to work together on things that we agreed with. We have some shared goals. But if something like this is to happen, it'd be much more helpful to have some specific direction on what Mndot's expectations are and what the city's expectations are. We think we can get that done this year. And then the third thing that we request your support of is a willingness to have Edina continue to work with Mndot in partnership with some of the other municipalities out there. As I mentioned, they haven't done this before for this purpose. So St. Paul is interested, Rochester is interested, Minneapolis is a little bit interested, and Duluth is on and off. I'm not sure where they are today. So whether Edina is the first one to get built, or the last one to get built, or somewhere in between, we think it's very important that Edina be part of those conversations so that decisions aren't made today that bite us in the rear end in 3 decades. So those are what staff would suggest occur in the next month or so. If there's a resolution to support this concept to the Planning Commission, we can certainly draft that and have it ready for our next meeting. Right now, we've got the verbal direction to proceed with that, but again, I think to help the community conversation and to make it clear about what is in and what is out, or like out of bounds versus inbounds, or what our timing is, I think it'd be very helpful to have that on paper. In the packet, and I have it up on the screen as well, but in the packet there were a number of position statements. This is draft. We do need some time to refine this, but I thought it might be helpful as talking points, because ultimately as we proceed with this long-term concept, we need to figure out some of these details of land use and planning and height. Comments about traffic came up this morning. They came up 8 years ago, they came up 6 years ago, and they came up this last fall. Traffic is important. Impact to the schools is also very important. That's something we have not gotten into any level of detail, because again, there's not even a firm proposal of what could happen here. But as a statement takes shape, I'd also urge that we address an implementation strategy, real estate strategies, and then I would say one of the most important things is to address the funding, the cost to build it, and the cost to maintain it. Those are high costs, there's high return, but there needs to be a strategic effort put forth before that. And then last, but certainly not least, is community engagement. We've heard several comments recently about how do I get involved, what's the due diligence process, et cetera. Staff certainly recognizes and encourages additional and vigorous community engagement on this project. At this point, we've been more in the engineering side of the conversation. Could we really build this, and is it financially practical? We haven't gone through all the details of what do we build, how big's the park, what's the use of the new public buildings, how tall is the building, what color is it, what shape is it. We haven't even begun that conversation. We had some of the open houses, but that was not the intent to get to that level of detail. But as this concept advances, of course, we'd have to do that. So with that, I'll leave my presentation there. There's a lot of food for thought in the packet as far as some of the statements. And if you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer those as well.
All right, I'm gonna go to Member Fisher in a minute, but first I think, going back to Lisa from Sunny Slope, her question was due process. What does it look like here? And as I sit here listening to you, I can see where not only Lisa but everybody else in the audience would be wondering, at what point in time is there something to comment about, or how do we get engaged? Because it actually goes back to what Mr. Gertner said, and I didn't articulate very well at the beginning with my comments, that we've had situations before where we've had land that was actually developed. Here we just have an idea of creating, basically, and I think someone said it in one of their emails, we're talking about creating a new neighborhood where nothing existed before, not with really existing land, although Mndot has developable land next to the right-of-way. We're talking about airspace here. So I'm sure people are wondering, and I'm wondering, you know, how do we immerse public in the engagement process here? How do we do that? And then I want to have Member Fisher lead us off on the conversation. So that's the question for you.
Oh, okay.
Due process.
Yeah,
What does it look like? And
Yeah.
when do we start it?
Yeah.
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 And if we don't know yet.
Yeah,
then
I
we
don't have
know
a
yet.
specific answer for you on that. So last year.
What point do we need to get to be able to have that conversation?
Yeah.
Another way to put it.
Yeah. So if this concept has merit, and so far at our last conversation, you said that it does have merit, we were directed to do a couple things. To include this concept generally in the long-term comprehensive plan, to do nothing that would disallow it, but also you made it very clear to me that you were doing nothing to fund it or enable it, but you didn't want to do anything to disallow it. So I think as a comprehensive plan draft comes together this fall, that certainly is probably the first point of community conversation about this concept at this location and others. And I'll turn it over to Carrie to give detail.
So for folks in the audience, Carrie, would you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you, members of the HRA. I'm Carrie Teague. I'm the Community Development Director. So I just wanted to be clear about the comprehensive plan. This was not included in the scope. You recall when the council was deciding on the scope of the comprehensive plan, it was decided to not include additional study in this area. By adding acreage over the freeway, that's adding a land use that's not accounted for essentially. So it would require an amendment to the comprehensive plan. Right now, this project at this scope and scale is not part of the 2018 update.
Okay, and then while you're there, one of the residents asked about how do we get input on the comprehensive plan? I know that you've been having some public meetings, but there are many more to come here as we go through the last part of the year. You want to talk about that a little bit quickly?
Yeah, certainly. So as mentioned, we're doing those small area plans. So there's been a lot of community input and community meetings held with each one of those. We will be having, the Southdale plan is ongoing. That group meets essentially twice a month. We have a lot of community input at those meetings. The public attends most of those meetings. 50th in France is ongoing. We have an upcoming community meeting next Wednesday.
And you might talk about how those groups that are working on those small area plans are composed.
Yeah, they're composed of members of the public. So each small area plan has a task force that's been created, made up of members of the Planning Commission and selected residents and business owners of the community. So there's additional input coming through the comprehensive plan with those.
No.
How do we know what small area your house is part of? How do I know if I'm this or that? I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just I don't know anything about Lease, and I don't understand how would I know? Is it precinct? I mean, how do you know?
So with the upcoming meetings, we will be having, once the plans all start to come together, we would have output and outreach meetings that the entire community would be invited to. Also, once the draft of the comprehensive plan is put together, that would be brought before the Planning Commission for a public hearing, and then the Planning Commission makes a recommendation to the City Council. So there would be two full-scale public hearings, one at the Planning Commission and one at the City Council, when all of those plans come together.
All right, so if somebody wanted to attend from the public a small area plan meeting for Southdale or for 50th in France, how do we post those up? How do they find out where to go?
Those dates are posted up on the website, and they can contact planning staff to find out additional specific meetings. I don't have those dates in front of me, but they are posted on the website.
Okay, all right, good, thank you. All right, Member Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We're going to deviate a little bit, I think, from your conversation, Bill, just a touch
Oh,
to give,
that's fine.
you know, as we talk about our individual ideas here, or thoughts at this moment
Can
in
you
time.
just go to under file, full screen? Or maybe there's a quicker way. It's my old. Oh, view. Full screen. Thank you. So, thank you everyone for being here and for, you know, we've gotten a lot of emails about the concern of this project. And the first thing that I want to dispel is I don't see it as a project, I see it as a long-range vision. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And what I actually asked, and I know I'm not the only one up here that asked for this to get on an agenda so we could have a conversation where we could just share a little bit about what's in our heads. What are we thinking when we allocate money towards a planning effort, and why would we do that? And I just want to say right off the top, I understand, you know, if, and this is one of the things that's been amazing for me, you know, you get on a body like this and everything we do is transparent and it's public information. But when, particularly I see it with the HRA, we're sitting in meetings, you know, every other week, negotiating with developers, talking about development issues, talking about what if we do this compared to that. And every one of those things at a moment in time could be put out and put in a newspaper article in a way very much out of context because it's one thing we're talking about. It's not something we're planning on doing. We have to look at these ideas. But we can't go in a back room and talk about a great idea. It's like, wow, when we get this to the point where it makes sense, we should come out and talk to people. It's always out in the public, and sometimes the ideas aren't ready for prime time, I would say. And Bill, I think you did a good job articulating some of that. And so when I got the agenda and saw that it was actually on the agenda, I had to scramble a little bit. So much of what I threw in this was done at about 2 a.m. this morning, maybe about 2:30 this morning. So I'm a little scared to actually flip these slides because we'll see what the spelling looks like. So what I wanted to do is help everyone understand how we got here. And Bill, you did a nice job from the beginning of when we started talking about a lid. But I want to go back a little bit further and give a little bit broader context. And I'm glad you didn't talk about this part because then it would have been really awkward and repetitive. But in December of 2008, we finished up roughly about December 2008, our last comprehensive plan was being completed. And I was on a committee that was working on that. And it identified Grandview as one area of potential area of change. And a number of them we mentioned tonight as those areas. And at that time, we had a lot of projects that were happening, you know, in the previous years. I had been on the Planning Commission. I had seen, you know, the consultants would do these studies and they would go on for a long time, and we weren't really, you know, they were like sort of put on a shelf and not even really approved. And so I actually approached the mayor with a couple other planning commissioners and asked if we could try a different sort of process. So in December of 2009, we made a proposal for a Grandview planning process that was completely community-led, no consultants, just figure out what we might want to see or think about in this area. We ended up doing 10 meetings in 20 days. It was led by a citizen advisory committee. We also put together a group of volunteer architects and designers that were all Edina residents. I found out in that process that there are over 110 architects that live in Edina. So we had a nice pool to reach from. On April 2010, we had a kickoff meeting. Through the process, we had business and property owner meetings, developer roundtables, many community open houses. On April 23rd and 24th of 2010, we had a design workshop, 2 days, or it was mainly on a Friday, Saturday, with those architects. And what I wanted to do is just show you a couple, like 4 sketches, came from 4 different hands, bunch of people sitting around a table. And I think it's interesting because these are all Edina residents that were brainstorming about this area. And in each one of these, there was some sort of connectivity over Highway 100 and this idea that we should somehow connect this part of our community. What was also happening is there was strong interest by some members of the community that were involved in that for a community center on the public works site. One of the things that drove some of these sketches was to say, well, if we want a community center, why wouldn't we put it on the city hall side? And Bill, you talked about this, what we'll call this crevasse of weeds and grass and extra highway infrastructure that is essentially helping nobody today. What if we, in that, and it's an elevation change, you said it, there's a hole there. You could have multiple levels of parking with a community center on top on the east side, connect across so buses could pull in, never come up on the top, they could stay down below. You could park during the day, go downtown, wherever you're going to go by bus at night, and when community centers are heavily used, the same parking gets used. That's what initiated some of these original sketches. And again, different architects were doing different scenarios. This is one that you could even imagine that yellow dot on, or building on the east side as a community center with this green linkage. Different ways of expressing these ideas. Bill said it, at the time, it was like, oh, that's crazy. Like Mndot would go along with something like that, right? Or that we could afford that, or just doesn't make, and people that really wanted the community center said, we don't trust how long that would take. We would rather take a community center on the public works site today than take the risk of 20 years from now or 30 years from now getting a community center on the other side of the highway. So the idea just sort of went away at the time, but that was 10 years ago. So that process went along, and it's 20 days, and after those 20 days, the city council actually approved the guiding principles that we still talk about today. In November of that year, we actually put the whole report together and turned it in. Because of that community-led process, not one consultant was involved. Staff was able to apply for a Met Council grant, a $100,000 Livable Communities grant, which we received. And that allowed us to hire a consultant team to prepare what we call the Grandview District Framework. And that process involved usually around 52 community members that were on a steering committee that met regularly, that talked about the future of Grandview. And I'm talking Grandview, I'm talking about the whole broad area, not just, again, at that point, we weren't even talking about LID. That was an idea that came and went, and we were on to other things. That finished a year later in April of 2012. And there's just one image out of that report, kind of flying over City Hall here, looking west, and you can see that we had added a lot of streets, and if you look back, I don't really have the ability to point at this, but you can see the public works site with some housing, with a community facility of some sort, and a public outdoor plaza, those key elements, which interestingly, 10 years later are still kind of the components we're wrestling with and talking about. But it all came from these community-led efforts. So in April of 2013, about a year went by with just focus on other things. 2013, the city council started focusing on that public works site, just one parcel in that big area. We went through it, not we, but the council at the time went through a selection of a developer partner and has been doing ongoing design and financial studies that are still continuing today. In 2015, I think, Bill, you said it was more like 14, but in that area, Mndot and the U of M Design Center actually approached the city to look at a proposal for a LID here. And that was because they were doing these studies, looking at other areas in Minneapolis, connecting the University of Minnesota with downtown area. And I don't know what all the reasons were, but it was interesting that Mndot was coming to the city saying, this idea is not a crazy idea. There might have some real validity because we have a ton of land and not enough money to build out our transportation infrastructure in the state of Minnesota. So we have to be smarter about how we use our property to further communities' needs and to get our mission done, which was building highways and roads. So independent of that, the city was putting out an RFP in roughly 2015 for a district-wide transportation study. Because in the framework plan, that's what one of the key things that was called for is we got to look at the transportation network, because These are all great ideas, but if the street network can't handle it, whatever, then they're not really good ideas. Interestingly, that was a point where I'd been off the planning commission for a while. I wasn't on a city council, and this is what I do for a living, is planning and urban design. I was sitting in my office looking at this RFP thinking, boy, I hope they hire a really good team that can really look at a big picture and capture that kind of thinking. And I realized, wow, I'm not on anything in Edina. I could put that team together. So I actually did, and I brought in what I believe the best transportation designers in the country, put together a team, and we were actually selected to do a transportation study for the Grandview area. And that study was completed in August of 2016. And the reason I want to make sure everyone understands this is there were some things in that study that I helped write. I understand it and I believe in those things, and I want you to understand what's in my head and what I think about when you look at something like a lid. So again, at the time, there was no lid per se, but we understood that it was in discussion out there, that Mndot had come to the city, that there was this level of discussion. In the transportation study, and all of this stuff, these reports are all online, we talked in terms of planning timelines, right? And this is where this really gets important. In that study, we talked about short-term being 0 to 5 years. What sort of things might you do in the street network and the transportation network? And bicycles and peds were a big part of this, by the way. Then we had medium, that was 0 to 5. Medium term, 5 to 15 years. Long term, 15 to 30 years. And then because long term didn't seem long enough, we had what we called far term. That's beyond 30 years. And that's where we put the discussion about the lid, okay? And just to, in the report, I just wanted to pull out a quote because I wrote it. And it doesn't, it's just an opinion and a transportation study. But the things that had to be realized before you could seriously look at a lid was this realization of an enhanced transit serving this district. That includes additional local and regional service related to Highway 100. And that could be bus rapid transit or something. But also taking advantage of the existing rail corridor. That's either light rail or modern streetcar options. And then, of course, the enhanced bicycle and pedestrian. In other words, if the assumption, and this was just an assumption made back when we were doing a transportation study of this area, is that in order to build a lid, probably be expensive, to pay for that, you'd have to build enough density to pay for that. And if you did that, that would have impacts on our transportation infrastructure that you'd have to have serious transit opportunities to make that work. It was an assumption, it wasn't a detailed study at that level. The far term study was not done. And just to remind everyone, when we're talking about 30 years out, we are 10 years in on this planning in this area, and we don't even have anything on the public works site yet. 10 years. So it is not inconceivable that something, when you talk about a lid over a highway, we're not talking about building it tomorrow. Literally talking about far-term kind of opportunities here. So now I want to shift from context to just sort of why. Why would we do this? And some of these quotes are from emails that we received. One of the comments was, we want naturally occurring development, not this forced city planning stuff. And I honestly can't think of what that would be. What is naturally occurring development? I know a lot of people talk about that at 50th and France, but I will assure you that 50th and France is essentially an urban shopping mall designed and brought to you by the city of Edina. That plan, I've got plans from 1974 and earlier where it was 4 gas stations and empty parking lots, and that area was planned. The parking system, the ring road, everything was planned. There's nothing naturally occurring. What cities do is that you set these long-range visions, you create the zoning and the comp plans, all that stuff that allows the development community to come and build out your city. So to say it's naturally occurring or that's what we should do would suggest that you have no plans and you just let whatever happens, happens. So that's really not a thing. What we want to do is do really smart development and smart planning. And sometimes we have to look way out there to do that. And you could look at examples in Edina, whether it's Centennial Lakes or Edinburgh or even the Southdale area years ago, how that works. This comment about protecting our neighborhoods, absolutely. Absolutely. It's the most important thing we can all do. It's what drives much of our city. But you've heard the terms throughout today, these small area plans or these areas of potential change. Essentially, it's the 10% of our community that isn't single-family neighborhoods. So we've talked about all of them: Southdale, Grandview, 44th and France, 50th and France, Cahill, Wooddale and Valley View. Those are those areas of potential change that we're going to see change. And what we're trying to do is keep the character and the quality of our neighborhoods that we all live in and we all take great pride in, and make sure that we can still keep that quality and grow as a community. A lot of this, don't spend our tax dollars on this project. And I bolded the word project because, again, we think of projects as, a developer comes to us and we kind of vote up or down and we talk about, should it be a story higher or lower and what color brick? That's a project. This is a long-range plan, a long-range vision. And so the question is, what's appropriate to spend on something like that? When do you spend it? When do you not spend it? Why do we even invest in this? And this is, again, I'm just speaking, from my perspective. You elected me and put me here, and I'm trying to do the best job I can today in this environment. And my philosophy is, and I've talked to some of you about this, if I want an oak tree in my front yard 50 years from now, a mature oak tree, I have to plant the seeds today. I can't just show up 50 years from now and say, where's the oak tree? Now, there's also the thing about, I think if you add up the consultant fees we've paid over the last 3 years, it's like $380,000 to $400,000. And I know there's staff time and other things we have to factor into that. We are a $100 million operation. That's a typical annual amount of money we spend here and there just to do what we do as a city. And over 3 years to spend, let's say, call it $400,000, that's, a third of 1% of what we spend just doing what we do. I would actually be angry with us if we weren't investing some amount of money into the far-term planning of our community. We spend so much time thinking about the stuff coming at us today and how we react to it and what we're doing. We have to always have our eye way out there, okay? That's, I think, really important. And I think it helps us make better decisions. And I'm just going to give you a quick example. This transportation plan that we did, finished in 2016. There have been 2 projects that we approved in the last couple of years that I would argue are better, and we understood what to do better because this plan was done years ago. And one of them is on the school bus garage site, and it's where the number 3 is, down and sort of towards on Eden Avenue down there, if everyone's kind of oriented to this. Between that site and Jerry's, we anticipated a street running east-west, which would link back around to the Jerry's parking ramp. And that was important because we're also projecting a street where that number 2 is there that goes east-west, both coming out to Vernon. In other words, we're creating a street network in Grandview that allows cars to move around and people to move around more efficiently, so we take the pressure off these key intersections like Interlochen. In other words, that neighborhood to the west can actually connect and not have to go up and come out on Interlochen. When the bus garage site was being developed, we were able to show this to the developer, and they actually gave some land on the north side of their site to allow the eventuality of a street to come through. Whether it ever happens or not, we know it can happen. We have allowed for it, and we can plan for the future. That's why you do plans. The same thing, a lot of us people are thinking we're crazy for allowing a caribou up on Interlochen and Vernon. Well, we were able to deal with that because we knew in this plan it talked about that the only way you're going to improve Interlochen is to add another left turn lane, but we can't do that without taking someone's property. And so it actually in the plan said we're going to have to find all these other ways to improve that flow, including these other streets. But when that project came along, we realized it's not just a coffee shop, it's a coffee shop with an opportunity to improve the intersection. And that seems crazy because you're adding a coffee shop at a busy intersection, but in fact, that's what it will accomplish. We talked about that big ideas plan. This was precursor to the comp plan where community came and got on this 30 by 30 map and talked about the future of Edina. And the outcome of that was a diagram about what we all brainstormed on that Saturday. And there were not just one lid potential, there was 4 of them talking about how we better link our community. Does it make sense? I don't know, but part of what we're looking at with this study may not even be that it ends up right here, right? So what we're learning with this investment today is what are the economics of lids, right? What makes sense? I actually would argue that there's probably a better chance the Southdale area group right now is talking about how you link that whole Southdale area over crosstown to the Strachauer Park neighborhood and make traffic. Not everyone has to go on France Avenue for local traffic to get over, or the growth and advancement of our medical district. These are things that might make sense 20 years from now, 30 years from now. So studying the economics of a lid makes sense today. So why do we there's a document that had the year 2020 on it for construction. I get it. That would scare the crap out of me if I was sitting out there. And it's a document that was put together. I don't know, staff or consultants, someone put that date on there. But part of that is we're trying to find out today what barriers exist for that long-range vision. When you go to a legislature or Mndot, they're agencies that are in the today, and they're trying to deal with. So if you're talking about barriers that may prevent this from ever happening, we have to know what those are and figure out, are they barriers that can be overcome or not? And to do that, to have those conversations in today's world at a legislature or at Mndot, you have to put a date that seems pretty real. I would argue that that's not very real because you couldn't even design this thing by 2020. But anyway, that's why I think you see some of that, and I get it, and I'm sorry if people are, freaking out thinking we're going to build something in 2020. I've never believed we're going to do that. I've always believed this is a long-term idea and something we should invest in and think about. And I would agree with a comment that was made. We should be looking at how little development can we build on that lid and still make it a viable, useful thing for the city of Edina. And that's the part we haven't even gotten to yet. We know we can make it viable by building a bunch of stuff, but how little can we build? How do we balance that with the transportation network that we can even create, and that all has to come together. But it's all done in this public realm, and this is a plan it's not there. We can't say this is what we want to do. The last thing I'm going to address is this concern about not including this Grandview Greene in the 2018 comp plan. I don't think we have to put in all of this into the comp plan, but I think we should have a couple paragraphs that say, we've been studying this. It's a long-range vision. It's something that we will continue to look at. It's marking where we are in time and history. And I will say it's important because 10 years ago, when I was on the committee doing the comp plan, we had an idea for Cahill Gardens, that whole light industrial park on the west side of Highway 100 with freeway interchanges on 2 sides, a railroad on the other, a regional bike trail going through it now. We had one paragraph in our comp plan that said there's an idea here that someday this could be a whole new neighborhood with housing and industry and office and connectivity and parks. And the council at the time was scared about that. And they thought, well, that seems, wow, we shouldn't have that in. And they pulled it out. 10 years later, we're doing a comp plan, and it's amazing. None of the same people are involved. In 10 years, we have that kind of turnover, and that's good. except there's a group working on the Cahill corner that had no idea that that idea had ever even been discussed. And that's bad. I think that's bad leadership and government to forget about things that we've thought about in the past. It should at least be a paragraph so we have some continuity of ideas and flow. That's just my feeling. So in summary, and I'm so sorry I've taken this amount of time, but it's really frustrating for me that we have this disconnect and anger and concern, and I just want to make sure we're sharing where we're coming from. And this is where I'm coming from. I think this is a long-range vision. It's an important investment to invest in our long-range future. We got to do it right. I would never approve a lid if it was going to compromise the very quality of life that we have today. And I think you should mention it in a comp plan when you're looking at your future. That's my thing.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Member Stewart.
Thank you. I will try to be brief, as being cognizant of our time here, but I expect we will run over a little bit. So I would like to talk a little bit about my own evolution of thought and my views on this. When I ran for city council 4 years ago, I was an admitted lid skeptic. But I confess I did not know much, but it just sounded like kind of a wacky idea that would cost a lot. And I'm kind of a numbers guy, so it just seemed to me that it was not a very viable thing, but I had really only scratched the surface when I expressed those views. I do think of myself as someone with a good level of curiosity, with open-mindedness, and since joining the council in January 2015, I've had the chance to evaluate some of this information that Mr. Neuendorf presented earlier. I've had the chance to meet with some city planners and learn more about this. And even though I will not call myself a proponent of the lid, I am now of the view that it is an idea worthy of study. And again, a long-range idea, as Member Fisher suggests. So why is, and Bill outlined sort of the benefits for the community on this, but let me also try to create a sort of a macro context for some of my thoughts on this. The population of the United States will continue to grow. I believe the population of the Twin Cities will also continue to grow. And I think that's a good thing. That's a sign of some health in our community. If we don't keep up, if the Twin Cities don't keep up with the national growth level, we have bigger problems to deal with. But there's also a movement away from urban sprawl and toward a desire for people to live closer into some of the urban hubs. So that means that Minneapolis will have some growth in population, but it also means first-tier suburbs like Edina will have some pressure to increase as well. And I think it's inevitable. And I think we as a council, therefore, have a duty to plan, not put our heads in the sand and pretend there won't be growth, but to plan for the growth that I believe is inevitable. And so all of us in this council, in my knowledge, have expressed a view that we believe the most important thing for us to do is to preserve the integrity of our single-family residence neighborhoods. We think that is the crown jewel of Edina, and we very much want to preserve that quality that we all love about our city and our community. Where will the likely future growth take place? Well, we've identified these nodes of potential density that have already been described. And again, this is a very long time frame that we're trying to think about and as Mike said, plant the seeds for how things might unfold and be wise in terms of where we invest tax dollars, where we invest the efforts of staff and everything else. And yeah, there are some ideas that come up that percolate up that are not great ideas. There are other ideas that percolate up that get implemented, and there are other ideas that percolate up that you think, oh, that's going to really take some work to figure out whether or not this makes sense. And I think this is one of those last ideas. I heard somebody suggest that there was a foregone conclusion. That concept is shocking to me because this is going to be a long, arduous process, and I think there are no foregone conclusions. I think there are information that we have yet to discern. The numbers actually can be compelling, but again, I don't think there's anybody who thinks we ought to build things out to the maximum capacity as the mayor suggested. And so we want to get our arms around it, and the level of complexity has also been described. It's a very complex set of issues. It involves Mndot, of course. It involves, so we got to deal with the state of Minnesota and potentially the state legislature. We have to deal with the county. Vernon Avenue and 50th are a county road, and we have to deal with Edina. And so we want to make sure early on in the process, if there's any sense in going forward with this, we want to make sure that the expectations of all of those groups are consistent with one another. So talking about some of the potential deal terms, things like air rights and things like that, does make some sense, even though I think, as Mr. Neuendorf suggested, it's too early to be signing a lease, but what would it look like if we were to do it? I think it's important to understand that. And so, yeah, I think there are details that need to be filled in. I think we have a responsibility to the future of Edina and to actually future city councils to do the homework, to help unpack these ideas, to help figure out. And if we spend money and decide in the end it's not a good idea to do this, well, that's really well spent money. If we spend money on investigating the concept and decide it is a good idea to do it, that's probably well spent money too. So I think being informed, getting the information, understanding what the pieces are going to look like does make some sense at this stage. So I'm a believer in continuing to learn and study and get those details hammered out so we can make wise, and really I'm probably talking about future city councils, can make wise decisions. So thanks.
Thank you. Member Brindle.
Thank you. I just have a couple of things. First and foremost, I remain open to any idea that is brought forward. And this is truly still in the idea stage. I hope that is clear. I think that possibly in the staff report, looking at the words lease structure, I looked at that and I went, lease structure? Are we that far already? How can we possibly be that far already? But what I believe that means is with the current governor in place, with the current commissioner of transportation in place, if there is to be a framework for how the right-of-way possibly could a lease to have a long-term vision of how Edina and Mndot would work together in a lease to have access to that right-of-way property. I think that's what that means. And I'm sorry that staff report is so vague because it hit me and I went, wait a minute, and actually, I sit up here, and it took me a couple of days to recall a conversation about, with current administration in place, we've been talking to them all along about their interest in possibly doing this, and I think that's where the words lease structure come from. So they have nothing to do with development. They truly, I believe that, and I guess I would like some confirmation from staff on that. But that certainly got my attention, as it probably got yours. In the comp plan, as you look through the comp plan, there is a term of potential area of change, identifying an area of our community that could have some change, and the areas of the small area plans are those, if you look at the 2008 comp plan, those are the areas that said potential area of change. So I suppose we stretch the definition of that a little bit and say that the idea of doing something across a major conveyance now could be a potential area of study. And so that if we were to include it, that's probably how I would recommend including it. It is not a project. All the pretty buildings you see on a picture, those are confusing because we're not there. The way this came across, because I was on the council when the Grandview small area group was working and diligently working, and what they showed was a relatively narrow conveyance across Highway 100 that was for pedestrians and bikes. And it stayed that way, in my mind, until the idea of flushing it forward a little more like this. So I mean, the idea really is, you've got Mndot at the table. Could this happen? Got the county at the table. Could this happen? You've got Met Council at the table. Could this happen? So yes, there are minds thinking about this, but it's certainly not to the point where we are going to say yes or no. And it's not to the point where we're even going to look at land use other than green space. That's my opinion. Now, the meeting schedule, I would like to ask, because when I go on the website and say small area plan meeting schedule, I find a flushed out meeting schedule for the Southdale Working Group, but I find a meeting schedule in the past for 70th and Cahill. So they're kind of over here and over there and over there. And if you don't know what the small area plans are, it's hard for you to find out what that schedule is. So I'd like a comprehensive schedule that shows all of the small area plan meetings that are coming up that the public can participate in or observe. I don't know, some of these have gone past their public and they've had their public hearing, and some of them have not. They all will. But I would like a more comprehensive schedule so it's easy to find. And if you have to search for it, all you have to say is small area plan meeting schedule. Better yet, since we are in the throes of the comp plan update, so why not across the bottom, there are the quick links. Let's put one of those for the comp plan meeting schedule and include all of the small area plans in that list. So I think that can make it easier to find. I don't doubt that they're there, but I'm sort of a stickler for, this could be easier. We should make this easier. So if it can be easier to find, and I know that all of you in this room you're demonstrating keen interest for a variety of reasons in development in our city. And you'll want to be part of that. So those are my comments.
You can see this, the pressures of work have caused some people to have to leave, same pressures we're all subject to, but all of the concerns that have been raised this morning, I think, are concerns that all of us up here have had as well. I think we share that in common, that we worry about the same things that you worry about, but where we've had a slight advantage is we've been kind of thinking about these things and had a dalliance with this idea for over a decade now. So we've gotten a little bit more comfortable with some of these issues, how they could potentially be dealt with. So for me, as we've worked on this, when we first started talking about a broader sort of lid concept, remember Brindle mentioned how it had been a more constricted or constrained concept at one point in time. The notion or the question for me is, could we potentially improve the quality of life for our residents through an evaluation of this lid concept? And the reason I ask myself that question is because I think we all know in this room, and certainly all of us on this council, that Edina has always been on the leading edge of innovation and vision amongst communities, not only in the metro area, but in the country. We're the first city in the metro to have a planning department. We are constantly thinking about where we want our town to be 20, 30, 40 years from now. And so we engage the public periodically in these conversations about where should we be heading. So the notion that, at least at a threshold basis, that we could potentially improve the quality of life for our residents through this connectivity between East and West has some distinct appeal to me. If we find out at some point in time that these potential benefits are outweighed by potential adverse impact to an adjoining neighborhood, as Member Stewart said, our single-family neighborhoods and the integrity of life, the quality of life in those neighborhoods are foremost in our mind. We're not going to do this. But just like any company that invests in research and development, I think our city has an obligation to do that as well. There isn't anybody in this room that's in business, and a lot of them had to leave, that aren't constantly thinking about where they want their company to be going. And I think that's one of the reasons that Edina has been so much on the cutting edge of innovation in city work and also envisioning where a city wants to go. We need to be thinking about that all the time, because the status quo will send you backwards. You just don't know it for a while. And sometimes when you figure out what happened, it's too late. And if there's anyone that can talk about that more effectively than Member Stewart, I don't know who it is, because he sees this in the world that he operates in. You've got to be thinking all the time about where you want to be heading and what kind of change is coming your way and how you're going to manage that change for the betterment of the people in your town. And that's what we're trying to do up here. We're trying to do it to the best of our abilities. And so I think our responsibility is to take this to the next level and see where we can head with this. And I think, Member Fisher, thank you for all of that groaning you did. And I can't believe you were that coherent at 2:30 in the morning, but or right now after sleeping for just a few hours. So I think it's important for our community that we explore this further, that we look at it further, that at the appropriate time we start getting people involved when we have more than just the germ of an idea here. And this, to me, too, as Member Stewart said, this is money well spent. You can't do research and development for a business or for a town without some risks. And you're going to have successes and failures, but this is certainly an investment worth making. So I think we should keep this moving forward, see where it goes. And I think somebody mentioned too that I think it was Mr. Christensen, the school district. We interact with the school district, I think, weekly. We have meetings with them all the time. We're sensitive to this. We've already hired the state demographer to look at impact on the schools, on all these apartments that were being built, and I think it's a de minimis impact, but it's something that we're aware of too and are concerned about, the quality of our school district, because between our location and the quality of our school district, and this is what drives people to Edina and makes us such a desirable place. So I think we've had some great thought this morning expressed. Thank you, Bill Neuendorf, wherever he went to, for your input. There he is, always hiding behind the computer screen. So I think going to the next step is appropriate here. And I hope that was enough guidance for you, Mr. Neuendorf.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Do you want to hold off that last item on the agenda for another meeting? We've held it over once already.
Yeah, the last item is just a project update. It's in the packet. We can have discussion at a later time.
Okay. And you're still meeting with all the business owners down at 50th and France on Fridays, and everything's going well there?
Still having lots of meetings, lots of engagement on 50th and France, and yep.
Yeah.
Still on track.
All right, okay. Anything further from Councilman?
Item D was taken off the consent agenda. Did we need to have a discussion about that, or is it really just to receive the information that we, okay, because I read the information in the packet, but I didn't know if...
The latter, just to receive the information.
Thank you.
That's the way I read it, too. Okay, all right. Nothing further. The HRA meeting stands adjourned.